Picture a ship's surgeon in 1747, standing over 12 sailors who are all dying of the same disease. Their gums are bleeding, their teeth are loosening in their sockets, old wounds, healed for years, have quietly reopened on their own. Nobody on that ship knows why. Nobody on Earth knows why. Not really, not yet. The word vitamin doesn't exist. It won't exist for another 165 years. And yet, at the exact same moment, those sailors are dying from a disease with no name, communities on the other side of the planet, hunting seals through Arctic ice, or grinding corn with ash in Mesoamerican kitchens, are quietly avoiding that same disease entirely without a single one of them knowing what a nutrient even is. They weren't taking supplements. They weren't reading food labels. They were doing something both simpler and, in hindsight, considerably smarter. So how did people with zero concept of biochemistry manage to avoid diseases that stumped trained physicians for centuries? The answer isn't luck. It is a set of behaviors so deeply embedded in ancient life that nobody needed to understand why they worked. They just worked, quietly for tens of thousands of years, until modern science finally caught up and explained what these people had been doing right all along. Let's start with the disease that opened this video because its story is the clearest window into just how long humanity spent flying blind. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, a nutrient your body cannot produce on its own and cannot store for long, which means humans need a fairly steady supply of it, or the body's connective tissue quite literally begins to fall apart. For centuries, scurvy devastated long sea voyages, killing more sailors than combat, storms, and shipwrecks combined during the Age of Exploration. Nobody understood why until 1747, when a naval surgeon named James Lind ran one of the first controlled clinical trials in medical history, giving different groups of scorbutic sailors different remedies, and discovering that citrus fruit cured the ones who received it dramatically, within days. Even then, nobody knew why citrus worked, just that it did. Vitamin C itself wasn't chemically isolated until 1932, almost 200 years later. Which means for nearly 2 centuries, humanity had a working cure for scurvy and zero understanding of the mechanism behind it. A strange gap between practical knowledge and scientific explanation that shows up again and again throughout this story. But here is the detail almost nobody expects. Some ancient and traditional peoples had already solved this problem, long before Lind's trial without any citrus at all. The Arctic is one of the least hospitable places on Earth to find vitamin C. There are no citrus groves at the North Pole. Fresh vegetables are scarce or entirely absent for most of the year. By every intuitive assumption about nutrition, Arctic peoples should have been the most scurvy-ravaged populations in human history. They weren't. Traditional Inuit and other Arctic communities, subsisting almost entirely on meat, fish, and marine mammals, showed remarkably low rates of scurvy, a fact that genuinely puzzled early European explorers who assumed a diet with almost no plants had to be nutritionally deficient. The explanation turned out to be something modern nutrition science had to rediscover. Raw and lightly prepared animal tissue, particularly organ meats and certain marine foods like whale skin, actually contains meaningful amounts of vitamin C, enough to prevent deficiency in someone eating it regularly. Cooking, however, destroys much of that vitamin C through heat degradation. European explorers who cooked their meat thoroughly out of habit and safety concerns were unknowingly destroying the very nutrient that would have protected them, while eating diets Inuit communities would have considered strange in the first place. Several tragic Arctic expeditions in the 19th century, most famously the doomed Franklin expedition, suffered severe scurvy despite traveling through the same environment Inuit communities were thriving in. A difference researchers now attribute in part to differences in food preparation, not food availability. The people who'd lived there for generations weren't just surviving on a diet outsiders assumed was deficient. They'd unknowingly solved a nutritional puzzle European science wouldn't fully understand for another century. Let's move to an entirely different disease and an entirely different, equally clever solution, this time from Mesoamerica. Pellagra is caused by a deficiency of niacin vitamin B3, and it became a devastating epidemic wherever corn became a dominant dietary staple without a specific preparation step attached to it. The symptoms are brutal, skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, and in advanced cases, death, a condition sometimes summarized by doctors as the 4 Ds. Here's the strange part. Corn actually contains a reasonable amount of niacin. The problem is that in raw or simply cooked corn, that niacin is chemically bound in a form the human digestive system can't easily absorb or use. Mesoamerican cultures, going back thousands of years, developed a technique called nixtamalization, soaking and cooking corn in an alkaline solution, typically water mixed with lime or wood ash, before grinding it into the dough used for tortillas and tamales. This process, developed with zero knowledge of biochemistry, chemically frees the bound niacin in corn, making it nutritionally available in a way raw or untreated corn simply isn't. Populations that relied heavily on corn as a staple, but who also practiced nixtamalization, showed little to no pellagra. When corn was later exported to Europe, Africa, and parts of the American South as a cheap, reliable staple crop, without the accompanying nixtamalization tradition, it triggered devastating pellagra epidemics that killed and disabled tens of thousands of people, a public health disaster that took Western medicine well into the 20th century to fully explain. The fix had existed in Mesoamerican kitchens for millennia already. Nobody outside those cultures had thought to ask why they prepared corn that particular way. Vitamin D tells a slightly different story because for most of human history, ancient people didn't need to solve this problem through food preparation at all. They solved it just by living outside. Vitamin D is unusual among nutrients because your skin can actually manufacture it using a chemical reaction triggered by ultraviolet light from the sunday, hitting a compound in your skin cells. Ancient humans, working, hunting, foraging, and traveling almost entirely outdoors, got consistent, regular sun exposure as an unavoidable byproduct of simply living their lives. No supplements, no fortified foods, no deliberate sunbathing required. This actually shaped human biology in a visible, measurable way. As early humans migrated out of equatorial Africa into regions with weaker, more seasonal sunlight, skin pigmentation gradually lightened over many generations. An adaptation that allowed more ultraviolet light to penetrate the skin and maintain adequate vitamin D production in places where sunlight was scarcer for much of the year. Darker skin, rich in melanin, offers strong protection against UV damage, but blocks more of the light needed for vitamin D synthesis. An advantage in intense equatorial sun and a disadvantage in the dim, short winters of northern latitudes. Lighter skin represents the opposite trade-off, more vitamin D synthesis with less built-in UV protection, favored in environments where sunlight was the limiting factor instead of sun damage. This is one of the clearest examples in the human body of evolution quietly solving a nutritional problem before anyone understood there was a nutrient involved at all. Rickets, the vitamin D deficiency disease that causes softened, bowed bones in children, existed throughout history, but it became a genuinely widespread epidemic, specifically during the Industrial Revolution, when crowded, smoke-choked cities and long indoor working hours cut people off from the sunlight their bodies had always depended on. Ancient humans didn't avoid rickets because they understood vitamin D. They avoided it because their entire way of life kept them outside. Beyond these individually engineered fixes, ancient diets had something built into them structurally that modern diets often lack entirely: sheer variety. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer diets among groups like the Hadza in Tanzania document communities regularly consuming somewhere between 100 and 800 different plant and animal species across a year, depending on region and season. Compare that to a typical modern diet, which, according to global food surveys, often revolves around a surprisingly small number of staple crops: wheat, rice, corn, and soy, accounting for a huge share of calories consumed worldwide. A diet built from hundreds of different foods across the seasons naturally covers an enormous range of micronutrients, simply because different plants and animals concentrate different vitamins and minerals in different amounts. Miss a nutrient in one food source, and there is a reasonable chance another food eaten that same week supplies it instead, an accidental safety net built entirely from dietary diversity rather than deliberate nutritional planning. Ancient humans weren't balancing a nutritional chart. They were simply eating whatever the season and the landscape actually offered. And that unglamorous habit turned out to be a remarkably effective defense against deficiency, almost by accident. There is also the matter of which parts of an animal ancient humans actually chose to eat, and it wasn't the parts modern supermarket culture has trained us to prioritize. Muscle meat, the cuts that dominate a modern grocery store, is actually one of the less nutrient-dense parts of an animal. Organ meats, by contrast, particularly liver, are extraordinarily concentrated sources of vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin B12, folate, and iron, in quantities that dwarf what an equivalent amount of muscle tissue provides. Ethnographic studies of traditional hunting societies consistently find organ meats treated as prized, sometimes even ceremonially privileged food, often eaten first, at the kill site before the group even returned home with the rest of the carcass. This wasn't a cultural quirk without explanation. Organs are, nutritionally speaking, the most valuable part of the animal, and hunting cultures across wildly different continents and climates arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about their importance, independently, with no shared source of information between them. Modern nutrition science would later confirm, one nutrient at a time, exactly why liver in particular deserved the reverence it was given. Ancient humans didn't need a lab to figure out organs mattered. They just noticed generation after generation which foods actually kept people strong and which didn't. Fermentation deserves its own mention, because it may be one of the oldest, quietly brilliant nutritional technologies humans ever developed, discovered without any understanding of the microbiology actually taking place. Fermented foods appear across nearly every traditional culture on Earth, from cabbage transformed into sauerkraut and kimchi, to milk transformed into yogurt and cheese, to soybeans transformed into foods like natto and tempeh. Beyond preservation and flavor, fermentation often measurably increases the availability of certain vitamins. The bacteria responsible for fermentation can synthesize additional B vitamins during the process, sometimes increasing a food's nutritional content beyond what the raw ingredient originally contained. Natto, a fermented soybean dish traditional to parts of Japan, is unusually rich in vitamin K2, a nutrient important for bone and cardiovascular health that is genuinely difficult to obtain from most other common foods. None of the cultures that developed these fermentation traditions understood bacteria, vitamins, or biochemistry in any modern sense. They understood something more useful in the moment. Which foods, prepared this particular way, kept people healthier than the same foods eaten fresh. There is one more overlooked source of nutrition in this story, one that predates every other human behavior we've covered: breast milk, and specifically colostrum. Colostrum, the thick, nutrient-dense fluid produced in the first days after birth, before regular breast milk comes in, is extraordinarily concentrated in antibodies, vitamins, and immune supporting compounds engineered by millions of years of evolution to give a newborn's immune system its very first critical head start. Every single human who has ever survived infancy across the entire span of human history began their nutritional life with this exact substance, a system so old and so effective that modern infant formula still measures itself against colostrum as the biological gold standard it has never fully replicated. Long before written nutrition existed in any form, evolution had already engineered its own version of a multivitamin, delivered at exactly the moment a human being needed it most. So how did ancient humans stay healthy without knowing a single thing about vitamins? They didn't solve a nutritional puzzle. They lived inside behaviors that solved it for them, generation after generation, without anyone needing to understand the mechanism at all, eating a punishing variety of foods across the seasons. Because that is simply what the landscape offered, prizing organ meats, because experience quietly taught every hunting culture on Earth, independently, that they mattered. Fermenting foods because it made them last and, almost as a side effect, made them better. Living outdoors because indoor life wasn't an option. And sunlight came along for free, preparing corn a particular way in one part of the world, for reasons rooted in taste and tradition that happened to prevent a disease nobody there had a name for. None of it was vitamin science. All of it, it turns out, was vitamin science, running quietly in the background of ordinary life, discovered by trial and error, refined over thousands of years, and passed down not as biochemistry, but as recipes, rituals, and simple, stubborn habit. We didn't invent good nutrition when we discovered vitamins. We finally found the words for something ancient humans had already been doing correctly for a very long time.